Okay, so you want to open a brewery. Buy some tanks, brew a few batches of something better than what's on the shelf at the grocery store, slap your name on a can, and watch beer nerds line up outside your tap room every Friday night. That's the pitch. That's what the craft beer boom sold an entire generation of home brewers turned entrepreneurs over the last 2 decades. The idea that passion and a good recipe could turn into a real business. It is not that simple. And the story of what actually happens to the money inside a brewery, from the first fermenter you buy to the six-pack someone picks up at a bottle shop, is one of the most brutal, cautionary tales in small business, hiding behind one of the most beloved industries in America. Before you sell a single pint, you need to survive the cost of the equipment. And brewing equipment is not cheap in the way a coffee shop's espresso machine is not cheap. A small-scale brewing system, the kind that produces roughly 3 to 7 barrels per batch, enough for a modest taproom operation, can cost anywhere from $150,000 to $500,000, depending on how much automation and how many fermentation tanks you buy. That figure covers the brewhouse itself, the mash tun, the boil kettle, the heat exchanger, plus fermenters, bright tanks for carbonating and conditioning the beer before it's served, a glycol chilling system to keep everything at the right temperature, and the plumbing and electrical work required to hook it all together. If you want to can or bottle your beer for retail distribution rather than just serving it in a tap room, add a canning or bottling line, which can run anywhere from $50,000 for a basic mobile canning setup you rent by the day to $300,000 or more for an owned in-house line capable of real production volume.
Then there's the building itself. Breweries need tall ceilings to accommodate tanks that can stand 10 to 15 feet high, reinforced flooring that can handle thousands of pounds of liquid-filled steel, floor drains throughout the production area because you're constantly hosing down equipment, and industrial-grade electrical service to run pumps, chillers, and boilers simultaneously. Retrofitting an existing warehouse or industrial space to meet these requirements typically costs $100,000 to $400,000 on top of rent or purchase price. And that's before you've built out a tap room with a bar, seating, and a kitchen if you're serving food. All in, a small production brewery with an attached tap room commonly requires somewhere between $500,000 and $1.5 million in startup capital before a single beer gets poured for a paying customer, and larger regional operations with bigger production capacity and full distribution ambitions can run into the several million-dollar range. Here's where the fantasy usually breaks for the first time. People assume beer is a high-margin product because a pint sells for $7, and the ingredients inside it, water, malted barley, hops, and yeast, cost pennies on the dollar. That's true at the level of a single pint sold across the bar in your own tap room, where you keep essentially the entire retail price. But that math changes completely the moment your beer leaves the building, and understanding why requires understanding the layered structure of how alcohol actually gets sold in America. The first layer, and the one most new brewery owners don't fully grasp until it's too late, is something called the three-tier system. In the years following Prohibition, most U.S. states passed laws requiring alcohol producers to sell to licensed distributors, who then sell to retailers, who then sell to the public. A brewery, in most states, cannot simply sell its beer directly to a bar or a liquor store down the street, even if that bar is 5 minutes away and would happily buy a truckload. The beer has to pass through a distributor first, and that distributor takes a cut, typically somewhere around 25% to 30% of the wholesale price, in exchange for warehousing, delivering, and selling the beer to retail accounts. This isn't a small administrative fee. It's a structural layer built into the price of every can of beer that leaves a brewery's dock. And it exists specifically because of a regulatory framework that predates the craft beer industry by 7 decades. So walk through what actually happens to the price of a six-pack. Say a brewery sells a case of beer to a distributor for $30. The distributor marks it up and sells it to a retailer for somewhere around $40. The retailer then marks it up again to sell it to the customer, often doubling the price they paid. So that same case might retail for $75 to $80 on a store shelf. The brewery, the company that actually made the product, the one that bought the $400,000 brew house and the fermentation tanks and paid for the ingredients and the labor, sees only that first $30. Everyone downstream of the brewery is taking a bigger cut of the final retail price than the brewery itself keeps, which is the exact opposite of what most people assume about a product they picture as artisanal and premium. This is why the taproom became the financial backbone of the modern craft brewery. Not an afterthought, but the actual profit engine. When a brewery sells a pint directly across its own bar, it keeps the full retail price, no distributor, no three-tier markup eating into the margin. A pint that costs roughly 50 cents to $1 in raw ingredients sells for $6 to $8 in the taproom, an enormous margin compared to the wholesale channel. This is exactly why nearly every craft brewery that's opened in the last 15 years has built a taproom as its centerpiece, not because breweries suddenly discovered they liked hospitality, but because the taproom is often the only part of the business where the brewery captures the full value of what it makes. Distribution, the thing that sounds like growth and success, the thing that gets a brewery's cans onto grocery store shelves across the state, is frequently the lower margin, higher volume side of the business. The taproom is the smaller volume, higher margin side that actually keeps the lights on. The second layer of cost that catches new brewery owners off guard is excise tax, a tax charged specifically on alcohol production that doesn't exist for almost any other consumer product. The federal government charges brewers an excise tax per barrel produced, with a reduced rate for small producers, currently around $3.50 per barrel on the first 60,000 barrels for breweries producing under 2 million barrels annually, and a higher rate above that threshold. On top of the federal tax, most states layer their own excise tax on top, and the rates vary wildly by state, from under 10 cents a gallon in some states to well over $1 a gallon in others. A brewery selling into multiple states has to track and pay excise tax according to each individual state's rate and reporting requirements. An administrative burden that alone can require dedicated staff time or outside compliance help once a brewery starts distributing beyond its home state. The third layer is licensing and regulatory compliance, which operates on a completely different scale than most food and beverage businesses. A brewery needs a federal brewer's notice from the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau before producing a single drop of beer commercially, a process that can take several months. Then there's state-level licensing, which varies enormously depending on which state you're in, some straightforward and inexpensive, others requiring extensive applications, public notice periods, and fees that can run into the tens of thousands of dollars. Many states also require separate licenses for the taproom operation itself, distinct from the manufacturing license, plus additional permits if you want to sell beer to go, ship beer directly to consumers, or operate a restaurant-style kitchen alongside the taproom. Miss a filing deadline, misreport your production volume, or violate a labeling requirement, and a brewery can face fines, or, in serious cases, have its license suspended, which is functionally the same as being ordered to shut down. Clears throat. Now let's talk about what it costs to actually run the place day to day, because this is where the romance of craft brewing collides hardest with the accounting. Ingredients, water, malted barley, hops, and yeast are the cheapest line item relative to what people assume, typically running somewhere between 10% and 20% of the retail price of a beer sold in the taproom, though that percentage climbs significantly on the wholesale side once distributor and retailer markups eat into what's left. Hops in particular have become a volatile input cost. Specialty hop varieties used in popular styles like hazy IPAs can cost several times more per pound than standard bittering hops, and a bad harvest year in the Pacific Northwest, where the majority of U.S. hops are grown, can spike prices across the entire industry with little warning. Labor is a much bigger cost than most aspiring brewery owners initially budget for. A functioning brewery needs, at minimum, a head brewer, who typically commands a meaningful salary given the technical skill and food safety knowledge required, assistant brewers or cellar staff to handle the physical labor of moving kegs, cleaning tanks, and packaging, and an entirely separate taproom staff of bartenders and servers if you're running a hospitality operation on site. Unlike the brewing side, which can run with a lean crew of 2 or 3 people, even at meaningful production volume, a tap room staffed for weekend crowds requires the same kind of labor-intensive scheduling as any bar or restaurant, and that labor cost shows up every single week, regardless of how many people actually walk through the door. Then there's packaging, which is a surprisingly large cost category. Cans, labels, cardboard packaging, and the shrink wrap or 6-pack rings that hold everything together add up fast, especially for a small brewery that doesn't have the purchasing volume to negotiate the same per-unit pricing that a large regional brewery gets from its suppliers. A brewery producing a limited run of a seasonal beer often pays significantly more per can for packaging than the ingredients inside the can actually cost, which is a detail that surprises almost everyone who hasn't run the numbers themselves. Utilities are another underappreciated expense. Brewing is a water-intensive and energy-intensive process. It typically takes several gallons of water to produce a single gallon of finished beer once you account for cleaning, cooling, and the brewing process itself, and running boilers, glycol chillers, and refrigeration for cold storage around the clock adds up to a significant monthly utility bill that scales with production volume, not with how much of that beer actually sells.
Here's the structural risk that runs underneath the entire modern craft beer industry, and it's best explained through what happened to the sector as a whole over the past decade. For most of the 2000s, the number of craft breweries in the United States grew explosively, more than tripling in less than a decade, as home brewers turned professionals rode a wave of consumer enthusiasm for local, small-batch beer. But growth in the number of breweries eventually outpaced growth in overall beer consumption, which has been flat or declining for years as younger consumers increasingly shift towards spirits, wine, hard seltzer, and, notably, drinking less alcohol overall. According to the Brewers Association, the industry's national trade group, the number of brewery closings began climbing sharply in the back half of the 2010 and accelerated further afterward, with total brewery closures exceeding total openings in recent years for the first time since the craft beer boom began. This is the same pattern that shows up in Sears-anchored malls and drought-stricken ranches, an industry where the fundamentals looked strong enough to justify explosive expansion until the market simply became too crowded relative to demand, and the weakest operators, the ones with the thinnest margins and the least differentiated product, were the first to disappear. The competitive pressure compounds because craft beer's original advantage, being the interesting, flavorful alternative to mass-produced domestic lagers, has eroded as the market matured. Major beer conglomerates responded to the craft boom by acquiring dozens of formerly independent craft breweries, giving those brands the distribution muscle and marketing budgets of a multinational company, while still appearing on the shelf as though they were the small, local operation customers thought they were supporting. This blurred the line between genuinely independent craft breweries and conglomerate-owned brands wearing craft branding, making it harder for a small, truly independent brewery to differentiate itself on shelf space that increasingly favors whoever can pay the biggest slotting fees to retailers. Another cost, incidentally, that most new brewery owners don't discover until they try to get their product onto a grocery store shelf and learn that shelf placement itself frequently has to be paid for. At the same time, the rise of hard seltzer and ready-to-drink cocktails carved directly into the demographic that used to be craft beer's most reliable growth engine. Younger drinkers looking for something lighter and less filling than a traditional beer. A brewery that built its entire identity around hop-forward IPAs found itself competing not just against other breweries, but against an entirely different beverage category that didn't exist a decade earlier, and that consumer spending has shifted toward with real speed. So here's the honest picture underneath. Watch beer nerds line up outside your taproom. The equipment, the licensing, and the three-tier distribution system are all real and unavoidable costs of entry, and they are significantly larger than most aspiring brewery owners initially budget for. The margin math genuinely does favor the taproom over wholesale distribution, which is exactly why so many modern breweries have built their business model around on-site consumption rather than grocery store shelf space. And the brewery that survives long-term is usually not the one with the most creative recipe. It's the one that treated the taproom as the actual business from day one, kept its production scaled tightly to what it could sell without over-leveraging into equipment it didn't need yet, and built a loyal, local customer base that would keep walking through the door even as the broader industry got more crowded and consumer tastes kept shifting underneath everyone's feet. The beer was never really the business. The four walls people were willing to sit inside of were.